Shake, 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 Sinora, shake it all the time.
When you add a shake of Frank's Red Hot, you open a world of better. A world where wings bring out the flavor of game day any day. Where buffalo chicken dip takes any party up a notch. And where any slice of pizza instantly becomes the world's best slice of pizza. At least until the next slice. Bring every bite to life with the perfect blend of flavor and heat. Frank's Red Hot. I put that shit on everything.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And I'm joined, as usual, by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, welcome back. Politics Guys.
Happy 2025, Trey.
I know, it's our first 2025 show. It's obviously the best of the Politics Guys finally gets around on the 10th here. So we get all the good stories.
Before we get into the good stories, can I tell the listeners some interesting numerical properties of 2025?
You should.
Yeah. Well, if you take the expression 20 plus 25 and square it, that's 2025.
That's true.
Yep. And also, if you take 1 cubed plus 2 cubed plus 3 cubed plus 4 cubed plus 5 cubed plus 6 cubed plus 7 cubed plus 8 cubed plus 9 cubed, that's 2025.
Ah! Fascinating.
That's my two numerical properties. Okay.
That's fine. Well, see, this math brought to you by a professor of law. The only thing that I ever know about on math would be like ordinary least squares model, statistical modeling, right? I'm a social scientist. I don't, yes. That's what I do. Yep. I don't think about like squaring years. I love it. So, like I said, we've got some deep stories we're going to have to get into, Ken. And one, it doesn't always quite work out this way, but we are recording right as President-elect Donald Trump has been sentenced in New York court for his hush money case. And Trump, as we already know, was convicted on 34 felony counts, falsifying business records related to payments made to the adult film actress Stormy Daniels way back in 2016. Earlier this week, Trump's team had been arguing that proceeding with the sentencing would effectively interfere with his presidential transition activities, which is a unique argument to make since they had earlier in the year actually asked for the original delay. This should have happened in the summer, but that moved forward. And then again had to be paused as a result of should he be granted immunity from the proceedings as a result of the Supreme Court's decision. But that did not happen. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court even allowed this to move forward. And so this morning that happened. And specifically, Amy Barrett and the Chief Justice are the two who ends up siding with the 3 liberal justices to allow this to move forward. And that has caused, that's something we can talk about as well, Ken. That has caused a lot of consternation on the right. As a matter of fact, even among our own May mailmen yesterday, really coming at the Supreme Court for its decision yesterday for allowing this to proceed, arguing the common argument here effectively is that presidents and former presidents, well, if they're named Donald Trump, ought to have complete immunity from all kinds of convictions. Now, as we saw today, for those of you who were watching what went down, there is in fact no penalty. This is a discharge. So what that means is we will have the first ever convicted felon taking office, but he's not going to face any actual criminal penalties on that front. So, Ken, I'm curious on this front a couple of different ways. One is on the Supreme Court itself. One of the things that we oftentimes argue about has been, what as you like to put it, as our Discord listeners like to say, the Supreme Court, they're all kind of, if you're a conservative, you're just kind of corrupt, right? That's kind of the Ken Katkin argument. I think that's not fair. But here is, once again, I've often argued that that's not lockstep. We have Barrett, we have Roberts actually allowing this to go forward. So what do you think about that? And then I also think it's kind of inversely fascinating now that I cannot find a situation among contemporary Republicans where if you don't vote for Trump, somehow that you've lost your conservative card. I don't know. So there's a lot to be said there. I'll leave it there for you to give us your opinion on what the New York court did, and of course the Supreme Court's decision related to it.
I think the New York court actually was more lenient than they should have been. I do think there's a constraint that they can't put him in prison, at least for more than the 9 days until he becomes president. They'd have to let him out on Inauguration Day. But and I don't know that prison was really warranted, but I think more than a general discharge was warranted. There easily could have been a financial fine. The statutes called for that. There could have been a restitution order. There could have been conditions on release, such as ranging from community service to to the idea that he'd have to come back before the court on this conviction if he got another conviction. There's various things like that the judge could have done, and I think should have done. I think that the gross departure from ordinary sentencing, even for a relatively minor crime, this was a white collar crime, and I'm not saying that prison was necessarily warranted, but to have no penalty at all for a crime that he was convicted of after a trial, and that he had many opportunities along the way to try to come up with any legal argument to derail. I think that's wrong. And then when we get to the Supreme Court decision, I guess I will acknowledge, as you said, that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett, were not, their votes didn't seem to be tainted by the usual partisan corruption. But certainly the other four who voted the other way were. There's no explanation for the other four votes other than corruption. There's literally no legal principle that could possibly have supported the idea to intervene in this case. In fact, although the opinion doesn't mention it, there's a federal statute called the Anti-Injunction Act, which prohibits federal courts from, including the U.S. Supreme Court, from enjoining pending state criminal cases before judgment is entered. There's no doctrines whatsoever that appear in any court case ever that would have given any kind of immunity to someone who's not president on the day of sentencing and wasn't president on the day of the conduct. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I can't see how there could be any explanation for federal court interference other than just raw corruption.
Well, and see, on that front, I guess I'm going to have to agree with you. I can't quite figure out why the idea that is floated right now among conservatives is effectively that presidents and post-presidents have complete immunity from all criminal activity, right? Just period. And again, I'm not a constitutional law scholar, but I am a presidential scholar. And I can say that even that kind of idea would, if we look back at, say, the George W. Bush's term in office, when we really kind of had that idea of the unitary presidency come forward and some of the responses to it, and even conservative circles dealing with that. I'm thinking of the book, The Creation of the Presidency, for example, by Thatch. Or the imperial presidency, where that no conservatives were putting that kind of presidential doctrine forward. Then this seems to me to all be just a wholesale creation, specifically and solely for candidate Donald Trump. And again, as a scholar of the presidency, I understand that there's going to be a lot of individuals who are going to say, well, Trey, that's just you, showing some of your leftist tendencies. And my response is going to have to be, no, that's just me showing my scholarly tendencies. Yeah. Well, and also, even John Woo never made the argument that presidents, think of the strongest unitary presidency theorist out there. And they were not in, the 2000s making that kind of argument.
And even more to the point, the already, I think, ridiculously corrupt Trump immunity decision that the Supreme Court gave down last year actually does explicitly say that the immunity does not extend to pre-presidential conduct, nor would it extend to anybody who's not actually president at the time. There is in there, as you point out, some discussion of post-presidential immunity, where the presidents can't be held liable for after they're president for some conduct that they took while they were president.
But it had to be related to the duties of the president.
Yeah, this is not that, because this is conduct that occurred when he wasn't president, and he's not president today. So it's not even post-presidential. And so it's the immunity decision is actually pretty clear that the immunity that they're giving doesn't apply to that conduct. It even says so in explicit language. Some of the conduct charged here is not immune, and then the explanation makes it clear that conduct that took place when the president wasn't president isn't getting the kind of immunity that the court was talking about. So there's no basis for it. I think some of the arguments I've heard, which are similarly ridiculous, that you didn't quite name yet. I've heard some people say that because he'll have to now appeal during his presidency, that could be a basis for immunity.
Oh, but I think Charles Kirk was making that argument, for example.
Yeah. I think that is completely, totally foreclosed by the court's decision in the civil immunity cases, in the Paula Jones case and in an older case called Nixon versus Fitzgerald, because the court in those cases basically said that that even if the president had to participate in a limited way in a civil trial, that could be permissible while the president's in office, and that the real question is just how much is a plaintiff going to be able to be a drag on the president's personal time. And a criminal appeal, the president doesn't participate personally in that at all. That's a purely paper proceeding done by his lawyers. So it really doesn't implicate, if a civil trial, if Paula Jones could actually depose President Clinton while he was president, which is what the court held, and they said that the minor drag on his time is not an important enough reason to give him immunity while he's president for a civil suit about conduct that happened before he was president. Well, a criminal appeal would take even less of the president's personal time than a civil deposition would take. It would actually take none of the president's personal time.
And that's absolutely fair. But and again, I think this is one of these areas where, as a scholar of politics, we then have to start separating, right? We have kind of both the actual legal framework that you're talking about here on the legal side. We have the kind of the theoretical and pushing on the legal framework of political scholars and actual practitioners, and I'm talking about. But that is also separate then, I think, from what the political implications are as we move forward. And ironically, I think counterintuitively, Donald Trump dismissed this as that minor thing, once again, the culmination of the witch hunt. And here we are. I think politically, when we kind of look at the evidence, we look at that past behavior of Trump, I think this actually oddly helps him. I think this is the beginning of his inauguration process. He gets to put to bed the last bit in his mind of the case. His base gets to say, absolutely, now he's I can even see the T-shirts now about and kind of embracing the convicted felon narrative. I think this helps him going into a position of strength and moving into the beginning of his presidency, which I think is counterintuitive to what a lot of the politicos kind of on the channels are saying. And I think that's because they have not rightfully been inferring the real data the way that we have on the show. What do you think about that take, Ken?
Well, I don't know, helps or hurts. I guess it was true that during the campaign, every time something happened in these criminal cases against him, he was able to successfully fundraise on that. Certainly
have poll bumps. He had actually, if you look at the data, got little bumps from those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. I can't really predict it, but I think this is kind of. I don't know how much the general public is noticing what's happening today, because after all, nothing's really happening. He is being formally, the judge is entering a judgment of conviction, but it's in a case where the jury already convicted him more than a year ago, and he doesn't have to go there in person to be sentenced, and so there's no photos of him going to the court, and he's not being sentenced to anything. So it seems pretty minor to me. I'm sure.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's what hurts. So on the one hand, you get the narrative that he gets moving forward, and we have the empirical reality, as you noted, right? He not only dodges, but he gets these bumps, as I'm talking about. But at the same time, I think it's deflating to other individuals because you don't get those moments. There is, as you noted, there's not going to be any kind of penalty. It seems like a bit of a nothing burger, which again, then I think feeds the narrative of the Trump team, right? Here's the nothing burger. Nothing happened. And now I'm a convicted felon, quote unquote, but I'm president of the United States. Suck it. Right? Like, I mean, that just.
Yeah. Well, I think that'll be his narrative. I don't know that there's anybody who's going to think differently about him after today than they thought about him before today. I think his partisans will probably, buy that narrative, and his detractors will probably, say, well, now he's a convicted felon. And I guess in terms of the poll, that would have to involve changing somebody's mind about something. And I'm not sure, whose mind is being changed by anything that's happening.
Well, you got to be careful. I mean, as a scholar of this, I mean, one of the things we oftentimes ask ourselves, what items are changing people's minds? But oftentimes it's not. The primary effect that we're looking at isn't persuasion. It's not changing people's values, or it's not changing people's positions on individuals, but rather it's framing and priming effects, meaning that it changes the narrative surrounding something and thereby changes the way we're thinking about it. And those kinds of effects can be very, very profound. And so what I'm postulating here, Ken, is that the reason we see those kinds of poll changes is not the result of people feeling differently about President Trump, but rather different frames for President Trump trigger different individuals to be more or less supportive of him. And I think for those of us who tend to be relatively thoughtful, we're already kind of ingrained in our preferences. It seems hard for that to be the case. But for the bulk of American voters, they aren't necessarily as paying attention. And so frames and priming effects have a large impact on their outcomes and their preferences. So I hear you. I don't think this changes anybody's preferences, but I do think it has a profound framing shift, which does have profound political implications, in my scholarly opinion, at least.
And I guess so. But in terms of a poll bump, are you just saying that this is going to entrench his partisans into their belief that he's being persecuted, even more, or are you saying
I think it will extend outside of his partisans. I think that this frame is a good one for Trump that makes him look sympathetic to those who are not paying detailed attention, and therefore I think he gets a bump. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'll just say the verdict's out on that. To me, I don't know.
Fair.
Yeah.
So I guess what we kind of have to, on that front, maybe leave off on is to say, Donald Trump is going to now go down in history. He is going to be our first convicted felon president. And, whether that helps him or hurts him, that will be a new empirical reality. In addition to being one of our only, not the only, but one of our few non-sequential reelected presidents, he will be the first ever to be convicted of a felony. Any thoughts on kind of the historicity of that before we move forward, Ken?
Well, nothing new. I mean, he had already been found guilty by that jury even before the election. So, that was baked into the election. And as you've just been pointing out, that has ambiguous impact politically. And he's clearly started a program to really completely corrupt and weaponize the Justice Department, and his administration is going to be very focused on weaponizing the Justice Department simply as a sort of political secret police, or maybe not so secret, and not really focusing on crime in an even-handed way. And so I think his experience as a criminal certainly has something to do with that. And he's been a criminal for a long time, even before he was convicted. He's gotten away with many crimes in the past, and this one finally caught up to him. So one thing that maybe we should talk about on that front before we leave this subject is there was that when he intervened, when he asked the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene to stop this sentencing, he actually phoned Justice Alito about 2 hours.
Oh, that is fair. Yeah,
he filed the papers, and that's an interesting episode. Now, I want to be fair here and acknowledge that Justice Alito said after that call that that the papers hadn't been filed yet, that on the call they never discussed anything about the New York case.
They were discussing one of his recommendations effectively for a White House position.
Yeah, although that's ambiguous too, because he hadn't actually made that recommendation. But so there's a lot of ways to look at this, but it's not as simple in either direction, right? It's we could say it's not as simple as that. There's any evidence that they talked about the case. It's also not as simple as saying that the call was because Alito recommended this guy William Levi, because it's fairly clear that Alito also was surprised by the call and hadn't indicated that he wanted to talk to Trump about his former clerk William Levi, but he said that's what they ended up talking about. And I think the picture that seems to be emerging is that William Levi, who was a former Alito clerk back in 2010 and who was the chief of staff to Bill Barr when Bill Barr was the attorney general during the first Trump administration, that William Levi would like to have a high-ranking post in the next Trump administration, that a number of people around Trump had kind of blackballed him because of the fact that he was Barr's chief of staff. And apparently they've got this blacklist against anyone associated with Barr because they now consider that Barr wasn't quite as corrupt as they wanted, and they only want people more corrupt than Barr. And so apparently the story was that it was Levi himself who was both telling the Trump transition team, that they should talk to Justice Alito, who will vouch that Levi is every bit as corrupt as Trump wants, and that he's not going to uphold the rule of law the way Barr occasionally did in the face of a contrary order from Trump. And similarly, he was putting pressure on Alito to call Trump. And apparently Alito never did call Trump and didn't know that Trump was going to call him. But when Trump called Alito, apparently the story is that Trump also didn't really understand exactly why he was calling, and thought that he was returning a call from Alito, which Alito said wasn't true. So there's a lot of mystery about the origin of this call and why it happened. And I guess my read on it would be that all I think I could say is I'm willing to extend Alito the benefit of the doubt here and say that he didn't know that Trump was about to file these papers and that maybe they didn't talk about this case. But I nonetheless don't extend Trump the benefit of that doubt. And I think Trump purposely called Alito to talk to him about hiring a former clerk of his, just because he knew that he was about to try to file these papers 2 hours later, and he just wanted to ingratiate himself a little bit more with Alito just before he filed the papers. So I think even if he didn't explicitly talk to Alito about the case that he was about to file, he did give Alito the chance to make a pitch in favor of a former Alito clerk, which I think would make Alito feel favorably about Trump right at that moment, knowing that he was going to file these papers a couple hours later. And of course, Alito did vote corruptly just a couple hours later on Trump's side in that case.
Well, and I would say conservatives are going to say it's all about loyalty. It's all about loyalty. But whether you use the word corruption or loyalty, I think that phone call and these kinds of connections are indicative of kinds of personalized loyalty connections that aren't supposed to be existing in legal rational systems like the United States, right? Those are the kinds of behaviors that we see as comparativists, political scientists, we see in countries around personalized politics. And that is the antithesis of what you want in legal rational systems, right? You don't want loyalty to be, it's not that it can't be anything, but it needs to be tertiary or lower, on those lists. And so the one thing that I would add to this is that the fact that we have those kinds of questions swirling, regardless of the adjective that we're using, whether that be corruption or be loyalty, doesn't really matter to me as a political scientist, because it's indicative of personalized politics And that's a fundamental democracy problem. That's a fundamental democracy problem, just scientifically speaking.
Yeah, and in the first Trump administration, when he came in, not really expecting to win and not having any ideas how to staff up administration, he relied a lot on organizations like the Federalist Society to recommend people for his administration or for his judicial nominations. And not all those people were corrupt, but I think he looks at that as a mistake, right? That he had people in his administration.
It wasn't personalized. It wasn't loyalty.
Conservative but not corrupt, and that he's really making sure that he doesn't get anybody like that this time. And so that's what this whole vetting thing. He had a suspicion that William Levi, although having almost the most sterling conservative credentials that any lawyer with top level government experience could have, he's worried, well, this guy may be conservative and may be competent, but I don't want to hire him if he's not corrupt. And so that, and I know you're calling that personal loyalty, but I think that's the very subject of the phone call with Justice Alito.
Well, again, I'm just using the terminology that we use as comparativists, right? That personalized identity and loyalty question. Point being is I don't, no matter what we call it, I don't think it's a good thing. Right. When we take a look at what that indicates and what that does. Well, let's kind of move forward a little bit. We're not moving away from Trump because he has dominated, right, this week's news cycle. The end of it, of course, is the conviction. The beginning of it was his recent provocative statements regarding allies, specifically, but not limited to the ones getting the biggest attention: Panama, Greenland, and Canada.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
We all knew that a second Trump term was going to mean major foreign policy shifts. And here we have it, right? And so in his first news conference this week, Trump expressed deep dissatisfaction with the current management of the Panama Canal and suggested the U.S. should, quote, retake control due to excessive rates. And he links this specifically to Chinese influence. He argues that effectively we're paying the Chinese because they are somehow in control of Panama. In terms of Greenland, he not only reiterated his interest in reacquiring it this week, he sends his son to Greenland to kind of do a photo shoot and say, look, Greenland's all about becoming part of the United States, and has stated that U.S. ownership over Greenland is, quote, control over Greenland is an absolute necessity, end quote, for national security. And in the case of Panama and Greenland, when asked specifically about the use of military, he said that was totally on the table. He did not include that for his third on the list, which is Canada. Trump argued that Canada should be the 51st U.S. state, which is interesting just pragmatically, but I think there's some probably hyperbole there. But he argued that should be done economically, not militarily, specifically maybe imposing a 25% tariff on imports, specifically in his words, to address illegal immigration and drug trafficking. This has elicited strong reactions from the international community. And in the case of Canada, of course, Ken, given that Justin Trudeau has just stepped down, it also comes at a unique time for conservatives who think that they might be retaking Canada, potentially complicating their bid, although I don't think it's going to stop them from taking control. But we've had some really strong reactions from Panama itself, from Denmark, of course, in regards to Greenland. And then, of course, both of the political parties in Canada rejecting those proposals and emphasizing, of course, their own national sovereignty. And one of the things I'd kind of like to put on there is that, what's unique about this kind of language, other than despite the attempt to make this seem like, oh, presidents have done things like this before, the answer is, again, as a presidential scholar, absolutely not. There's a lot of misinformation going on about the United States and Greenland. I just want to start there. But even beyond that, some clear expansionist views being espoused by the presidency. And at least from conservatives and Republicans, it seems like we've got two major takes. One basically saying, oh, look, this is the amazing deal maker, Donald Trump, basically saying, if you don't make a deal with me, I'll take you over. Isn't he a great deal maker? In other words, downplaying the meaning of it. And then we have a lot of others, about another half, it seems to me. It seems like a little bit of a civil war on this front, saying, no, this is Manifest Destiny 2.0. This is Donald Trump making America great again. One of the things that makes America great is we're going to be bigger. What are your feelings on it? Obviously, that's kind of the conservative split. What's your feelings, Ken?
Well, first, I mean, none of this is going to happen. There's not going to be any. There's not going to be any military action against Panama or Canada or Greenland or Denmark.
I'm going to pause. Can I pause you? I don't often disagree.
Yeah.
I am not sure on Panama that I would be willing to rule out the possibility of of Trump using troops. I absolutely agree, like with Canada or Greenland. Yeah. Why so dismissive of Panama though? Because anyway. Sorry.
Yeah. It would never happen for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one, you need to have Congress authorizing something like that. And even though, Trump does have a lot of influence on the Republicans in Congress, it only takes a small handful of them to not go along with this. And for instance, Congressman Thomas Massey, he's never going to go along with something like this. No. There's a few, he'll never get a majority vote in Congress for a military deployment.
But he has 90 days to use troops without congressional authorization.
No, only if there's an attack on the United States, not otherwise.
True. But you can't imagine that President Trump strews Chinese influence as an attack on the United States in some ways and invokes the acts, moves it forward. And by the time those days are up, it's too late for Congress to really stop it because it's already happened.
No, because for one thing, I don't even know that the Pentagon would take such a blatantly unlawful military order. And we did see examples in the first Trump administration of the military refusing to follow unlawful military orders, mostly with respect to the use of troops domestically. But I think such a blatantly unlawful troop deployment would run into problems in the Pentagon. And the other thing is, what would be the point of it? Because if it ended very soon after that, if he trumped up some kind of, phony justification that China has somehow invaded Panama and invaded U.S. interests in Panama, and I don't even know what those U.S. interests in Panama would be. That he's got 60 days or 90 days to. I
think you're right. It's 60. I said 90. I think you're right. Well, it's 60 days.
It can be 90 because there can be an extension, but it's presumptively 60. At the end of that, the troops would have to come back anyhow, and then the whole thing would have been for nothing. Because he would cause a lot of chaos, which I guess he likes to do, but we wouldn't have an ongoing occupation of Panama. So I see no way out there. I look at the reasons he's talking about this as being twofold, neither of which relate to actually doing any of this stuff. I think one part of it is just he's playing a game of 3-card Monte. That he's about to actually implement or try to implement a lot of the most unpopular parts of Project 2025. He wants to
tariffs effectively.
Tariffs and which are going to be massively inflationary and ruin the economy. He wants to defund the Affordable Care Act and throw about 20 or 30 million people off their health insurance.
Well, and to be clear on that one, he doesn't even have to do anything. He takes no action and that happens. That's an easy one, comparatively speaking. Because the subsidies for it are expiring, right? And so it's a more untenable position even than you're suggesting. He doesn't have to take a positive action in that case. Yeah.
Right. That's right. But he's going to certainly not ask to extend that funding. Yeah. So when the campaign happened and people were talking about Project 2025, and it was so unpopular that Trump had to kind of try to distance himself from it. It's obviously the blueprint for his platform, for his administration, for his agenda, and he's going to start implementing it. And I think, so he wants to distract people away from that because he knows it's unpopular. So getting people talking about whether we should invade Panama or Canada or Greenland is just a way of distracting public attention while he's quietly doing things like letting 30 million people get kicked off their health insurance and not talking about that at all. So I think that's one of his purposes here, and I think the other purpose is, he is in fact, although I know no conservatives will agree with this, he takes his orders on foreign policy from Vladimir Putin, and he's trying to stir up dissension within NATO and possibly even drive such a sharp wedge between the U.S. and NATO that the U.S. ends up, either it probably already has lost its leadership role within NATO just by the fact that he was elected, but also, maybe even such a big cleave with NATO or such a big break with NATO that we withdraw or they kick us out or we just have a dysfunctional relationship. I think that's Putin's top agenda for the United States is to make mischief between the U.S. and NATO, and this kind of talk certainly does do that, and I think that's the purpose of it.
Well, I don't disagree that the future of NATO is foggy. I don't think there's a universe in which Europe kicked the United States out of NATO. And in part, and this is one item in which there is some factual truth to Trump's complaint, which is, the funding for NATO would not work without the United States, right? So we don't have to take Trump's extremism there. But he's not wrong in suggesting that if Europe kicked the United States out of NATO, the increase in spending that would be necessary from the rest of Europe would be not insignificant. I haven't done the math on it, but what would it would be a chunk of change.
Yeah, well, that would certainly be a countervailing consideration for Europe, and I don't know that they're going to kick the U.S. out. I'm just saying that's Putin's ultimate goal. But if he can just make the relationship more dysfunctional, then he's halfway to that goal, whether we get kicked out or not. And I do think that's what this talk is all about. I think Putin has communicated to Trump, you should start talking about stuff that's going to be extremely offensive to NATO, that's going to freak out NATO, because that then the relationship with NATO will become more dysfunctional. And, I think for Putin, kind of the ultimate would be maybe the U.S. can actually get kicked out of NATO. But I'm not predicting that will happen. But I think the quality of the alliance is already being degraded by this kind of talk. And, remember, Denmark and Canada are both in NATO. And, he's talking about actually military attacking allies that are military allies. And so, of course, that does harm to that kind of alliance.
Well, I guess the two things that I would shift on you, I don't disagree about what Trump is doing. We don't disagree there. I think, though, I don't think it is Vladimir Putin having an effect or control over Donald Trump. I think it's the fact that when you see strong, personalized, now, of course, Putin is a dictator. Let's be clear about that. He's a personalized dictator today. And obviously, Donald Trump is not a personalized dictator, but he obviously pushes in that personalized direction, like we talked about in other. What you're seeing is a simple function of the result that those kinds of outcomes are going to overlap. So I think it's a happy coincidence for Vladimir Putin that he has Donald Trump, who is trying to personalize American politics. And as a result, that overlaps with his pre-existing interests. I don't think there's the kind of connection that you're postulating there. And in some ways, I don't think you need to have that overlap, because I think those kinds of regimes end up pursuing similar goals, the same way that we see that democratic countries, legal rational countries, end up generally pursuing similar goals and therefore end up working together. Again, when you look at this over broad periods of time. I guess where I disagree with you a little bit, though, is I recognize, so for example, you say, look, it would be blatantly illegal. We can't do these things. However, we have now had 4 years of Donald Trump with some guardrails. And now I think we're going to have 4 years of Donald Trump with fewer guardrails. And so as an institutionalist, I'm not maybe as comfortable as you are saying, hey, in the case of like Panama, where we have a major amount of asymmetric power between these two countries, I'm not as comfortable saying that I think that the guardrails will necessarily hold. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that Trump is going to be a dictator. But again, I think that personalized style, minus some of the institutionalized controls we had in the first four, will potentially allow him to do things. And so I think we have to be very careful when he says stuff like this, because I think you're not wrong. I mean, it could be the three-hand Monty, and it could be more than one thing. But the other possibility here is you mentioned three crazy things, but you're really only wanting one of them. And Panama seems like the more obvious thing that he wants.
Well, yeah. So I first I want to agree with your point that that maybe I was overestimating the guardrails that'll be available in a second Trump administration. Although the Pentagon is a large bureaucracy, and even if he is able to put sort of corrupt partisans at the top of the civilian leadership of it in the Defense Department, you've got the Joint Chiefs of Staff are pretty able and effective politicians themselves, and I think there may I don't know how that's going to play out, but I can't predict that he's not going to be able to get his way with the Pentagon, but I'm not going to predict that he will. I think the verdict's still out, but I also think that there's a lot of reasons that he also doesn't want to launch a military invasion. I mean, look at what a disaster the Iraq invasion was for the first Bush administration. He would be rolling the dice in a big way about that if he did any kind of military invasion. It's true that the U.S. Army could probably subdue Panama with a minimum of casualties, but even a minimum of casualties probably won't be zero casualties. And I think war is always a little bit more controversial. To a great extent, what he ran on was that he would reduce the U.S.'s footprint around the world and its military footprint around the world, and so all this new imperialism is a little bit the opposite of what actually got him elected, I think. And so there's big political risks there that might also constrain him, besides the guardrails that might constrain him. And of course, the next president would give it all back anyhow. He's not going to have any lasting impact if he spends his 4 years violating U.S. law to such an extreme degree and unsettling the international order. Maybe if the next president is Vance, he wouldn't give it all back. But the next president, certainly who's a Democrat, would give it all back. And we got essentially nothing out of President Bush's Iraq invasion, and it did cost the United States a lot, and it cost the Bush administration a lot of political capital as well. So I think that's a model that Trump's going to have to be at least a little bit concerned about.
That is fair. The political constraints there, especially given what is in his coalition when it comes to peace dividends. I will absolutely grant you that as a kind of non-institutional guardrail that's possible there. I do want to spend, we're kind of running low on time. I do want to get us to our last story, which is the Justice Department and whether or not we're going to have the release of the special counsel report, so we can finish on that third. The Justice Department urged a federal appeals court on Wednesday to clear the way for the release of a portion or the first half of special counsel Jack Smith's report detailing into then President-elect Donald Trump. In court documents filed with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the government wrote that the Attorney General Merrick Garland has not determined to release the volume of it that would pertain to the other individuals, and therefore there would be no major issue. Effectively, there's kind of two volumes, and volume one would be the stuff with Trump, and volume two would be with our other two defendants. But this is as of right now, the court has actually sided with releasing the information as of today, but they're going to allow the pause that Justice Cannon put on it for the next 4 days, business days, so that he can make an appeal to the Supreme Court about the release of that document. So, Ken, what do you think about the Smith document release? And do you think, what do you think the Supreme Court is going to rule? Because it seems likely that they're going to rule on it, to next week, early in the week.
Yeah, I think by the same vote that you saw in the New York sentencing case, the court will rule 5-4 to just affirm the 11th Circuit decision, which does allow the document releases. And so I don't think the Supreme Court's going to intervene here. The only plausible basis for intervention would be the one that only Justice Thomas and none of the other justices signed on to in the Trump immunity decision, which is the basis that the entire independent counsel's office is unlawful. Right? Thomas said that in a concurring opinion that no other justice agreed with in the immunity case.
Right, we talked about that one on the show in some detail. Yeah,
but that is the only legal basis for blocking release of the reports, and that was Judge Cannon's legal basis for it, was that she adopted Justice Thomas's reasoning on that point, said that the whole investigations were unlawful, because the independent counsel's office was unlawfully constituted, and therefore they couldn't release the documents. So the court has already had a chance to weigh in on that. They voted 8-1 against that argument. I think a couple of the justices who didn't want to get into that in the immunity case may come over to Thomas's side in this case. So I would actually expect a 5-4 vote rather than an 8-1 vote. But I can't see. I really can't see Roberts or Barrett adopting that approach, and I don't see any other legal basis for blocking it. I would add that I disagree with Garland's decision to only release one of the two reports. I think that would only make sense if he had a reasonable belief that the co-defendant prosecutions would go forward. I think if the co-defendant prosecutions are going to happen, then it would unfairly prejudice those prosecutions to release the Jack Smith report in the documents case. But I think it's fairly obvious that once Trump takes office, those two cases are not going to go forward. So I don't really believe there's anything to prejudice. And if I were Garland, I would think it's against the very small chance that Attorney General Pam Bondi is going to continue to prosecute Trump's co-defendants. I would risk putting an end to those prosecutions in order to actually release the Smith report in that case. But Garland weighed it the other way. I think he weighed that wrong, and I think both should come out. On the other hand, I don't really think there's going to be anything in either of these reports that hasn't already been pretty widely reported on in the media. I don't think we're going to learn a lot by reading them, because everything about these cases was covered pretty closely. We already had the January 6th committee in the House of Representatives, which did a pretty good job making public all the information about the January 6th conspiracy. And the documents case, I think, more or less speaks for itself, and the evidence was coming out, the whole time through it. So I don't think we're going to learn a lot from these reports that we don't already know, but I certainly don't see any basis for withholding either report.
Now, I don't make many kinds of out there predictions often. I'm the conservative guy when it comes to predictions on the show. But I will say this, Ken. I think if Donald Trump gets another Supreme Court nominee in the next 4 years, it's Judge Cannon.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I
thought I was making an out there one, and you agree. I love it.
Well, I agree that's who he'd nominate. I think it would depend. I think right now with the Senate that he's actually got right now, it's not 100% chance they'd confirm her. But it is probably a better than 50-50 chance. But one thing I think about the current Senate, which is interesting, is McConnell has stepped down from the leadership. Thune's the leader now, but I still think McConnell would have enormous influence in situations like that. Like if McConnell decided to vote no on a nominee like that, then he would have, I think there would be 4 votes to vote no on a nominee like that. I think it's almost certain that Murkowski and Collins would vote no if McConnell would vote no. And I think it would be, there's various other people who there's some chance they would. I don't think those kind of senators are going to vote no if McConnell doesn't vote no. He'd have to show a little leadership there. But, he's not beholden to Trump in any particular way. He's not going to run for anything again. So I think so in terms of who Trump would nominate, I totally agree with you. But in terms of whether that would get through, I think it might depend on the next senatorial election, or if it was the current Senate, would depend on McConnell.
That's fair. Well, Ken, I think with that, we've come to the end of a busy week of politics in the United States.
Yeah, it has been. And, the TikTok oral argument is happening right now, but we didn't even, that'll be for next week's show.
Time, listeners,
yeah.
next time. Yeah, that's going to be a really, I think that's going to be a telling decision by the Supreme Court, because it is important, but it doesn't have quite the same obvious partisan positions on it. So it'll be more legally telling about what might be coming as we move forward. But we'll pause on that for now. We'll save that for another day. If you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I really hope you'll consider becoming one, because what we're about to do in just a few minutes, Ken and I are continuing our now 2-year odyssey through the United States Supreme Court. I'm sorry, Constitution and Supreme Court. We're doing both. And we've been going through it meticulously, and we're going to be beginning the 15th Amendment. So we would love for you to become a supporter and then get access to our 15th Amendment episode. But the cool thing about it is unlike the kind of weekly things that we do here, where we're talking about things that are a little more timely, the United States Constitution, Supreme Court cases about them, they don't come up every day. And so you can go back, you can follow along this really amazing take from the preamble of the Constitution all the way now to the 15th Amendment this week. And that's one of the major things you're going to get when you become a supporter of the Politics Guys. But not only that, you get things like our very active Politics Guys Discord group, and there's all different kinds of benefits at different levels of support. To figure it all out, to check it out, head to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you'd like to support us, we're also on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. You're going to find all of those support links at the end at the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. So again, patreon.com/politicsguys, or scroll down and take a look at those show notes. If you'd like to get that midweek supporter show, but you're just not in the position financially to get the podcast right now, we understand that. Just email us at mail@politicsguys.com and we can get that set up. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, or review us on whatever podcast app you're using right now, and share those episodes on the social media platform of your choice. If you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, or anything else you'd like to share, you can always reach us at, you guessed it, mail@politicsguys.com. For supporters, don't forget, you have access to us on Discord. We're also on Facebook and X, and again, you'll find all of those links in the show notes. I finish, as always, by giving a wonderful shout out to the executive producers of the Politics Guys, who are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new full episode next week, and here in just a few days with our supporters exclusive show. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.